I'm going to turn it over to Joe, who
Yep.
is going to do most of the discussion tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We greatly appreciate it. Next month, we're going to do, on the first Tuesday, we have a book coming up called Just Christianity, which is about reclaiming progressive Christianity. And I've forgotten the author's name, but I'll have it for you by the end of our discussion tonight. But thank you all for coming. And take it away, Joe.
Excellent. Well, thank you all again for gathering. And Heath, thank you for being here and taking up the invitation to be with us tonight. Great to see you. And
good to see you.
Also, likewise. And to hear a little bit about what's next on your horizon, what you're currently working on as far as scholarship is concerned. So maybe what I'll do to start off is just to give a brief introduction of you for those who may not know who you are, and then open it up to you, Heath, to tell us a little bit about Union Made and the arguments that you're making in Union Made. Take us back to the scene in sort of 19th century, early 20th century Chicago that really makes for the story behind Union Made. And then we'll have a little bit of conversation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Great. Sounds perfect.
All right. So for those of you who may not know, Dr. Heath Carter is Associate Professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, one of our PCUSA associated seminaries. And he teaches and writes about the intersection of Christianity and American public life. Heath came to Princeton from Valparaiso University, so not that far from Chicago, where he was on faculty there from 2012 to 2019. He also spent the 2016-2017 academic year as a William S. Vaughn visiting fellow at Vanderbilt University. He got his BA in English and Theology from Georgetown University. Actually, we overlapped a little bit during that time at Georgetown. I have some friends in common there as well. So always good to see a fellow Hoya here. And then received his master's from the University of Chicago Divinity School here in Chicago, and his doctorate in history from the University of Notre Dame. And we're delighted to have Heath here tonight to talk about his signature book, Union Made, Working People and the Rise of Social Christianity here in Chicago. It's a wonderful book. I've read through it a couple times. I've even drawn from it as I've been sometimes writing sermons or reflections that have some historical ties to Chicago and even to Fourth Presbyterian Church. And it's an important book, I think, in particular, because of the time that we're in now, with increased economic inequality and a lot of attention being brought to that issue from 2016 and beyond, as well as the role of social protest here in Chicago, in particular this summer with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, and social protest plays prominently in Union Made. And it's our congregation's 150th anniversary year. And so it's a time for us to really reflect on and look back at the role that Fourth has played and mainline Christianity has played in the making of Chicago, and the ways that we've succeeded in following God's call, and also sometimes failed or been challenged in following God's call to be witnesses in this city. So again, Heath, great to have you, and tell us about Union Made.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joe, for that really kind introduction. And I love you teeing it up also in terms of the history of Fourth Pres and Chicago more broadly. This is a book about, my book is really about this, and kind of incredibly to me at least, and I didn't think it was interesting when I was growing up in high school. I remember I thought that the Gilded Age was this like incredibly boring period that kind of happened between interesting wars. But when I was in grad school, the first book I read was about this period, and I just became utterly fascinated with it as a really important moment when kind of the world that we live in today started to be made. And I mean, one of the things that really drew me to it, and that I think comes through in the book, is it was a period of incredible suspense. And I think this is when I teach this period, try to really drive this home for students, who kind of, we live 140 or so years later. And so it seems like, well, of course this all happened, right? But in the time when this book was unfolding, it was very unclear to everybody what was happening. And in fact, I mean, one of the kind of backdrop of the story, right, the story about Christianity and the labor movement, which was kind of just getting going in the United States in the years after the Civil War. But part of what the context for that story and the way that it unfolded was in Europe, in Paris in particular, in the early 1870s, workers had taken over Paris. And Karl Marx looked at it and said, this is exactly the thing that I predicted. This is the revolution. And Americans are picking up their newspapers and reading about workers laying siege to Paris, and they are utterly terrified that places like Chicago are next to fall in this worldwide revolution. And in fact, Chicago was, if you read the book, you know that every 10 years, if not more often, in Chicago in the decades between the Civil War and the turn of the century, Chicago was basically overrun with violent confrontations between police and workers. And I mean, this is kind of if you look at photos from the period, like in 1894, after the Pullman strike had kind of been broken and devolved, huge encampments of federal and state troops in Grant Park, these kind of unbelievable moments where, for a lot of folks, it felt like the revolution was in the offing and something had to be done about it. 1886 was another big moment for this, right? The Haymarket Riot on the west side of the city, near West Side in Haymarket Square. Peaceful rally, police show up and a bomb goes off, and it echoed across the world, really. I mean, I think, one of the things that I came to realize as I was writing this book is that Chicago was a phenomenally important city in this period, and it was looked to by people all over the world as kind of the place where capitalism was being tested and forged. And it was also a place where Christianity was being tested and forged. And, you had kind of incredibly important figures like D.L. Moody and Jane Addams and whatnot, kind of wrestling with these industrial problems, with this crisis that seemed to be unfolding, and it had a very uncertain end. So in part, the book is about that drama, right? The question of, will capitalism survive? Will society as it had been developing to that point survive, or will there be a violent revolution? And what does Christianity have to say about that question? Is Christianity fundamentally compatible with capitalism or not? In fact, that was one of the big questions. And it's one of the things, as I was reading the sources for this book, that came up time and time again, was this question of, can Christians be capitalists? Or should they be capitalists? And, the churches had one set of answers to that question, and a lot of folks on the ground had others. And there was a lot of conflict and fighting around how to best answer that question. When I first started writing this book, and probably every book has a story like this. It was really started when I was just doing some reading for a seminar paper, and I was reading in a kind of conservative Christian newspaper, and it was a story that was kind of an op-ed about how in Wisconsin, this is in the early 20th century, a group of ministers had tried to form a union. And so I was reading along, and I was, it turned out that the state had basically said, well, ministers aren't workers. This was actually a big controversy in this period too. Are ministers workers? But the state had said, ministers aren't workers, so you're not workers, so you can't form a union. And I was looking, as I was kind of, you're reading and you kind of are anticipating what they're going to say about this. And I was like, they're going to come to the defense of these poor ministers whose efforts to form a union were busted. And actually what the editor said was, well, it served them right because they were trying to join the devil's cause. And so that really struck me. And it kind of created this question for me. Well, wow, that's, where did that sentiment, that kind of anti-union sentiment come from? And how did it flow? I mean, how did that work? I mean, I grew up in churches where, you could go to church on Sunday morning and hear someone preach, and with apologies to Joe and the other clergy here, I mean, like, you don't always agree, right? And so I thought, well, look, if your pastor's so deeply anti-union and you're a painter or you're a whatever, I mean, you're an ordinary worker, how do you respond to that? And I just didn't know, and it was very unclear. How did workers respond to that kind of deep-seated anti-unionism that was at least present in some churches? So that's how the book started. As it went along, it became clear to me that there was a really interesting story to be told. That was a story about how basically workers were in their own way theologians. That in union halls and in the shops and the mills and the factories, they were not sitting down, obviously, when they got home. For the most part, they weren't sitting down to write theological books, but they had a lot of theological intuitions. And for a lot of workers who were experiencing this kind of intense moment of industrialization, incredible class conflict in Chicago and across the world, they had these intuitions that, God was on the side of the poor, God was on the side of the worker. And they experienced on a very regular basis, a lot of pastors and church leaders who said the exact opposite. And, so I was starting to track those threads, right? That workers were, had these theological intuitions, and that pastors and denominational leaders tended to be sort of anti-union. So what happened? Well, a couple of things. I mean, one is that it became very clear to me that actually the story was even more complicated than that, because not all workers had those same intuitions. So I remember I was doing some reading on the 1877 Railroad Riots, which, if you don't know what happened in Chicago in 1877, this is something worth reading up about. I talk about it in the book. Basically, you had a collusion among railroad companies to suppress wages, and starting in the East, there was vandalism of railroad property and mass strikes, very kind of disorderly response on the part of workers. And across the East, this is very common in the Gilded Age. Basically, governors and local officials called out the militia. And so you had these instances of workers committing vandalism and then being met with violence. Well, in Chicago, it eventually came to Chicago. And in late July, at Halstead and 16th Street, at the viaduct there, a large crowd of workers on kind of parade were confronted by the police, who fired into the crowd, ran away when their guns were empty, came back, fired again. Something like 30 workers died. So again, you go and you look at the newspapers, and the newspapers of that period covered sermons pretty extensively, which is a great resource for historians. You can go and read basically full sermons. And so you think, wow, what is a minister going to get up and say after something like that happens, down the street from your church? And what you don't expect was, in a lot of Protestant churches in the vicinity, ministers got up and they said, "Good for the police." And they went on to say, one of them in particular said, "The worst thing about this riot is that more workers weren't killed. It would have taught those lawless beings the value of a human life." And the paper reported that in his congregation, there was just this sensation of kind of approval of what he had to say. And so the wonderful thing is that church had a membership directory and then the census, right? You can kind of, if you pair those two things together, the names of the people in the membership directory and then the United States Census, you can basically figure out the professions and kind of the social class of the people in that church. Turns out that church had a ton of workers in it. And so now I was left with this puzzle. Well, why would workers cheer the shedding of other workers' blood? And it turned out that they were a particular kind of worker. They were workers who were kind of on the make. They were making it. They were doing pretty well. They were typically native-born and English-speaking. And a lot of the people who had been shot were foreign-born immigrant workers who didn't speak English, who frequented the saloons and whatnot. So there were these fissures and fractures even among workers. That was one thing I realized along the way. And then the other thing I realized along the way was that it wasn't just sort of this story of static conflict between the workers' perspective and the pastor's perspective. Actually, the churches had changed their minds. starting in the early 20th century, churches, which in the decades after the Civil War were overwhelmingly anti-labor, kind of changed their minds and became very supportive of at least certain kinds of labor unions. And so that was the other kind of breakthrough along the way. And I realized that in some sense, workers had paired their kind of theological insights with a determination to basically hold pastors and denominational leaders' feet to the fire. So, they went to a church where the pastor was anti-union. This happened in Pullman, where there was this iconic strike in 1894. One church where the pastor was very close with the company railed against the strike, and within a month or two, a huge portion of the congregation had just left, and they all went to other churches in the neighborhood. So that was an example for me of them kind of voting with their feet, in kind of inserting themselves, throwing themselves into these kind of theological battles. People stopped subscribing to the Catholic newspaper when it opposed the strike, these kinds of things. And so over the course of a couple of decades, these workers convinced churches that if they didn't change their mind about labor, they were going to find themselves, if not out of work, at least out of influence. And so the book ends with really this kind of interesting moment in the early 20th century where churches that had long been very anti-labor have come on board, and basically every major denomination in the early 20th century comes out with a pro-labor statement on the books, and most of those statements are still on the books. So it's sort of an interesting thing to think about for us 100 plus years later, in a moment where something like 6% or so of private sector workers are unionized, in a society that has, again, a pretty extensive now history of pro-labor church teaching. So we can talk about why that is, but maybe I'll stop there and hear what you all want to talk about.
Thank you so much, Heath. I mean, such a work rich with insights about not only the crucible of 19th and 20th century capitalism, but also Christianity and how it's finding its way, and how Christians and church institutions are finding their way in the midst of this, in the midst of those big changes and transitions. So a few questions for you before I kind of open it up for general conversation, comments, and questions. One of the things I was struck by in your book were a number of the personalities involved, that in order to do the kind of or to engage in the kind of agitation that it took to eventually turn Protestant denominations and the Roman Catholic Church to a certain extent in a pro-labor direction, you had to have some really strong, interesting, sometimes personalities.
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about the personalities there? I mean, I'll name a few that I found interesting. So Maria Darker Wynkoop. Now we're on the threshold of Women's History Month, and I think a person who's worthy of us knowing here in Chicago, and David Swing, who was a pastor here at Fourth Presbyterian Church, and played an important role in sort of the modernist movements in Presbyterian church circles and theology, but kind of had what we might consider more of a counterintuitive view of the labor movement. So if you would just speak to a couple of the personalities in these Christian labor movements.
Yeah, Maria Wynkoop was someone I found late in the game, and I was so happy to find her. She was, and then it's again the thing that I've always loved about history and writing this kind of book is the detective work, right? And so I found this woman. I think I found her through the Tribune, because she had a column for a couple of years in the Tribune, and it was published under the name M.D. Wynkoop. And so, you start to kind of just search around, who is M.D. Wynkoop? And you realize, oh, it's Maria Darker Wynkoop. And, I started following the digital paper trail as far as I could find it. And I actually figured out that the village, she was English. She had grown up in Great Britain. And the village where she had grown up actually had basically digitized all of their records, like their church records and all this. So I was able to kind of piece together the story of her life. And she was just kind of a common, kind of ordinary, we call middle class today, I think, but from a kind of workers stock in England, and it had immigrated to the United States. And she brought with her, and I think the thing I found interesting about her and about this guy, Andrew Cameron, who's another important figure, both of them had grown up in the UK, and they had very different kind of just base level assumptions about where God might fit into the story of capitalism. And they both had this kind of intuition that the church, at the very least, needed to really go out of its way to care for the poor. And one of the things that Wynkoop got really fired up about was the fact that in Chicago and across the country in this period, I think a lot of people don't know this history, but I think it's quite interesting. Churches were often financed in part through pew rents. So you paid for your pew. And in fact, I don't know if this is true of Fourth Pres, but many churches today, historical churches, if you walk into the sanctuary, you can actually see the names of people. I go to Nassau Presbyterian here in Princeton, and you've got Grover Cleveland's got his name is on the pew. So people paid for their pews, and pews there was a market for pews actually, and the more front and center you were, the more expensive your pew was. And so a lot of people looked at this and they said, well, and actually in some churches, like I've got actually the map of the pew rents in one Catholic church from this period in Chicago. And basically they had like an obstructions, kind of like at Wrigley Field, and so if you got like a pew behind the obstruction, that was like the best deal, but you got the obstructed view. So yeah, I think basically someone like Wynkoop is looking at this, and a lot of the kind of first, second Presbyterian, maybe to some extent fourth, although it didn't come up as much in this context, churches had become these kind of very fancy places. In many cases, people would roll up in their very fine carriages and be dressed to the nines. And for people like Maria Wynkoop and her husband, they just didn't feel like they could really darken the door of a church like that. And so she wrote really passionately about the need for the churches to kind of embrace the plainer kind of Jesus that you find in the Gospels. David Swing was not interested in that project. Swing was a fascinating character, and yeah, an important figure in the history of Presbyterianism, obviously for your church. I first came to Swing in the way that I think most people trained in my field did, which is through the modernist controversy. He famously was brought up on heresy charges in the 1870s, and basically won the trial, but kind of decided to leave Presbyterianism after that and founded an independent church. So, when you think about David Swing, if you say David Swing to people in my field, they say, oh, David Swing, a liberal Protestant, kind of a typical early liberal Protestant. The thing that's complicated about that description is that someone like Swing and a lot of folks who shared his theological sensibilities, they were often extremely well educated, and they often, just as there was a market for pews, there was a market for pastors. And so there was kind of a career ladder that people were on. And if you were just getting out of seminary, you'd probably get placed in a kind of a struggling urban parish. Then you might go to a kind of small or mid-sized town and become the pastor of First Presbyterian in some, outer town outside of a major metropolitan area. And a lot of people had their eye on a place like First Presbyterian or Second Presbyterian in Chicago or New York. Those were the kind of prize. You were going to get the big salary. It was a big kind of pride of place. Swing was part of that world, and he was a liberal in the sense of his kind of theological convictions. He was pushing against certain sort of historical Presbyterian ideas, or at least people thought he was. But he was also part of this elite urban world, and he didn't understand the complaints that workers had. And frankly, he had no patience for them. And so Swing died right around the time of the Pullman strike. And he was just, after he died, actually taken utterly to task by workers, basically, who saw him as, and this is a trope in this period, right? That the churches had, in the view of many poor people and working class people, the churches had joined hands with the robber barons in a partnership. And it was a huge, in the view of many kind of common people, it was just a huge charade. The farmers called it churchianity. Some workers did too. It wasn't real Christianity. It was a different religion. And that the church had in fact left the way of Jesus and done this other thing. And so part of what workers wanted to see was people like Swing they love to talk about David Swing's mansion and his bathrooms and all the things that he was doing. And that was why he opposed unions, because that's how he got the gilded bathroom, fifth bathroom in his, beautiful home. And so, that was one of the things that they were really arguing, was that to come to support the labor movement was to come back to true Christianity for these workers. And Swing was part of the problem for them.
I think that's a really sort of sobering history for us to remember, especially knowing that I think as a mainline faith community, we've sort of come to embrace that liberal Protestant orientation that we have theologically, even if I think across our congregation, people would tell you there are a variety and a diversity of political and sometimes social and cultural beliefs.
Yeah.
But to also note that that liberal Protestant orientation is not without its own conflicts and challenges when it comes to absorbing and understanding economic inequality and being willing to do something about it.
Yeah.
That there is more of a checkered history there.
Yeah.
Another part of the history that I was sort of fascinated by, and something that you allude to in the book, but really I think becomes even more of a story sort of after the period of time in which your book is focused, and that's the role of African-American clergy and churches and workers in movements to reform labor, movements essentially to create a version of Christianity which is much more socially orientated. And so, when you get to 1919, when you get to the beginnings of the Great Migration, there's certainly more to the story. But you also captured in your book a couple of personalities, a couple of congregations that were engaged in that. Can you speak a little bit to the role that the African-American church played in it?
Yeah. So my book kind of ends basically around 1910. And as Joe's pointing out, in Chicago, you do have a Black community already in the 19th century. It's relatively small and mostly middle class. And starting kind of around the time when my book ends, you have what we call the Great Migration begins. And Chicago's Black community more than doubles in the 3 years of World War I. The first 3 years of World War I, I think it's like 60,000 or so Black Southerners migrate to the city. So, you get toward the end of the book, I talk about, for example, Reverend E. Ransom, who was a really key figure in Black church, the AME church more broadly, but certainly he has a kind of brief stint in Chicago where he does a lot, and he's very much grappling with these same issues. He has an essay or a sermon that he gives on, I think it's called "The Negro and Socialism," and it's basically him grappling with the racism of Chicago's unions, and that was a huge issue. I've given you this kind of overview of kind of workers' theological intuitions, but a lot of these white workers did not, even when they used rhetoric that was universal and it sounded like they were talking about all workers, they were talking about white workers for the most part. Early unions and well into the 20th century, unions were often racist and basically used race as a means of winnowing people out. Partly because they were afraid that including Black workers would make them less respectable or whatnot. There was a very difficult history of Black strike breakers being recruited by, for example, in the stockyards. Anytime there was a strike in the stockyards would actually pay to recruit Black workers to come and try to break the strike. And so, those dynamics became kind of very deeply ingrained over time, the kind of racism of the labor movement. Someone like Ransom looks at labor and says, on the one hand, we need the unions to be less racist, but we also, we need Black people to join unions because they're the best shot that workers really have. He became a really important voice for social reform in the AME Church and more broadly. Ida B. Wells was pastor for a little while down at Bethel AME Church. But certainly as you get into the 20th century, Black people wanted to join unions pretty much from the beginning. But I'm actually writing right now about in the South before the Great Migration, the story of the Colored Farmers Alliance, it was called, which was kind of a sort of union type thing for farmers. And the Farmers Alliance had a whites only policy, and Black farmers formed their own kind of separate organization, but they were never accepted. The only way they were even allowed to interface with the larger white organization was if they appointed white leaders to lead the CFA. So, there's a long history of Black people organizing and making, valiant efforts to organize, but also running into time and time again kind of a brick wall. There are sort of the most important exception of this in my period, and it's not really an entire exception, but would be the story of the Knights of Labor, which was a really big deal in the 1880s. And it partly became a big deal because the Knights organized women and they organized Black people. In the South, actually, the Knights were a majority Black organization. So they're kind of this really interesting example of like a big tent union in the 19th century. But they were just hammered after the Haymarket Riot, and there was a huge backlash to Haymarket. The Knights were implicated in Haymarket. That was a huge problem for them in the North. In the South, the fact that so many Black workers joined the Knights, which again speaks to this desire, right, to participate in this kind of industrial unionism. The fact that so many Black people joined made white people skittish about the Knights in the South, and so white people left the Knights for the Farmers Alliance, which had this whites only policy, and the Farmers Alliance grew by leaps and bounds in the 3 years after the Knights started to decline. So that would be the big example. In the 20th century, the big story is the rise of the CIO in the 1930s. And the CIO, which became big starting in 1935, was a union that was committed to organizing interracially. And it was working. And the CIO was becoming really big. And in fact, part of the story of the rise of the modern right and the South starting to break away from the Democratic coalition, oftentimes we put that in the 60s, which is certainly important. When you get the signing of these major civil rights bills, that kind of pushes the South finally out of the coalition. But the South had become very uneasy about the Democratic Party's support for labor under FDR because the CIO was committed to interracialism, and they quickly recognized that if the federal government continues to support labor and labor continues to be interracial, Jim Crow is going down. And so what we know is that by the late 1930s, the Southern senators that had kind of been in lockstep with the president through the early years of the New Deal start exercising basically veto power over all of the kind of late New Deal legislation. So that's when you get a lot of the kind of pushback on labor. You had the passing of the Taft-Hartley Act, which with Southern support, which really curtailed the rights of labor because labor had become at that point a force for a more racially equitable society.
Thank you, Heath, for covering that history, even the history sort of beyond the period of your book. This is a really fascinating look into those fleeting opportunities to build sort of intercultural, multiracial coalitions that bring together workers, bring together Christians of various different stripes, and often difficult to really instantiate and to really to let those movements get a foothold into our society. So kind of a a look at sort of the road not taken in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, and
So
I could just say that this is such a, in the book I'm writing right now, I mean, it's just so clear that, and it's amazing. I mean, someone like William Jennings Bryan, who is the focus of this chapter I'm writing right now, kind of a phenomenally interesting guy who was deeply, deeply convinced that Jesus was on the side of the common person. Bryan loved to be called, he was called the great commoner, and he loved it. He deeply believed that Christianity was a religion that championed the poor, but he never saw Black people as being part of that story. And that is such an important piece of, as you look at the kind of history of Christian social movements in the post Civil War United States, you have a lot of white people who are engaged in these struggles, but their inability to imagine Black people as their neighbors and as people that they might want to be in solidarity with, was both, obviously, I mean, one level just problematic, but on the other level, it really undermined their own movements in many ways and made them less powerful. The Knights were so kind of powerful in their heyday, and the CIO and its, partly because of its willingness to organize across those lines.
There's something to lament as well as something to maybe think about as we look to 21st century movements as well.
Yeah.
So I want to open it up to members of our audience tonight to raise questions, and you can do so through the chat if you'd like, or go ahead and raise your hand and we'll recognize you. So questions or comments as well.
I'm open to any kind of question. You want to push back? I'm happy to have that.
Carol, I see your hand, and you'll want to unmute yourself.
Yes, I've muted most people, so if you have a question, you should unmute yourself. Carol, you can hit your space bar too, Carol, and that'll take it off. With luck. Look, there you go.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you very much. I was trying to think a couple things. You wanted to be critical of Rauschenbusch. That's some of what you're doing in your book.
Yeah.
And wasn't his theme song was, "We're training prophets. That's what we're doing in seminary." And a prophet is someone who speaks truth to power.
Yeah.
And then some of the pushback was a concern for right beliefs versus right action. And there were all those kinds of conflicts. I guess I'm trying to get at who did that in the labor movement. Who, you mentioned some personalities, but who put the theology and the prophetic theology together with who was effective at speaking truth to power, who somehow got theology and social action together that was more of that moved along from Rauschenbusch. I guess does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't want to be, I mean, I think in this book, I'm not totally critical of Rauschenbusch. I mean, I think part of what I want to do is to sort of put him into a context where we understand sometimes he's been lifted up as the great creator of the social gospel, who, no one had thought these thoughts. And then all of a sudden Rauschenbusch came around and wrote these books, and, we all came to a new plane of understanding. So part of what I wanted to do was just to say that, 40 years before Rauschenbusch, there were a lot of workers thinking these things. To be honest, the biggest critique of Rauschenbusch worth making, in my view, would be that he was silent on lynching and silent entirely really about Jim Crow. Certainly, he would have known about it. It wasn't close into him. It wasn't something that he had a lot of firsthand experience of. But Ida B. Wells, already in the 1890s, had gone on a kind of unbelievable tour of trying to get white Christians in the United States. She actually went all the way over across the ocean to England, trying to get people to pay attention to the scourge of lynching and the ways in which lynching really just drove to the heart of the hypocrisy of white Christian America as she understood it. And Rauschenbusch says something toward the end of his career. He said, "I've never really said anything about the plight of Black people, and it's because I didn't know what to say." It's sort of an extraordinary confession for someone who, again, thought so much about the relationship of the gospel to the social world, and yet not to be able to have anything to say there. I think, who gets it right? I mean, I think my closest thing I've got to a hero is Ida B. Wells, to be honest. She's before Rauschenbusch and after him. She's just, I think, an incredible. If you don't know her story, she's also got an extensive Chicago story, and I think there's stuff. I think even since I've left the city, that they've named some things after Ida B. Wells. She was a devout Christian. She actually became a Presbyterian later in her life, and she was someone whose faith really drove her activism and kept her going in kind of what I would say is, one of the most courageous careers you could imagine. I mean, I don't know how much you know about Wells, but I'll just briefly say, I mean, she was a young Black woman from Mississippi who moved to Memphis and became a journalist. And when she was about 30 years old, one of her dear friends who she taught Sunday school with at the AME church in Memphis was lynched with 2 other men. And Wells was already, becoming a kind of known figure, but she became very known. She was driven out of Memphis because she published the truth, which was that people had been, white Christians, many white Christians in the South treated lynching as though it were a Christian activity. I mean, they dressed up to the nines and brought their children, and it was after church, and it was what a respectable member of the community would do, was to participate in this kind of brutal, heinous, murderous event. Lots of other Christians who didn't see it that way, lots of other white Christians basically saw lynching as, well, it's a terrible thing, but it's a response to an even more terrible thing, which is Black men raping white women. This was a lie, but it was a lie that was told so often that people believed it to be true, and they kind of wanted it to be true, I think. White people wanted it to be true because it was offered some kind of justification for the horror that was part of kind of the everyday reality of American life at that point. Well, Wells did the research and realized this is just a total lie, and she published it. And she was driven out of Memphis, and she could never go back. And she spent the next 3 years trying to raise consciousness and turn the church against the horror of lynching. And she couldn't get any white Christians in the United States to pay any mind to her at all. She goes to England. She gets people really, really up in arms in England, and she hopes that will generate the pressure that she thinks is needed on American Christians. And she comes back, and they just still don't care. She moves to Chicago, settles down, gets married, starts having kids, and became a kind of she kind of gave up on the national lynching crusade in that way, but was deeply involved with city reform efforts in Chicago, and knew everybody. She knew Jane Addams. She knew kind of all the reformers of her day, but she approached everything she did out of her faith. And I think it's not a lot of heroes in history, but she's one of them in my view.
Thank you. That's a good reminder too. Partly I raised because I went to Colgate Rochester, but in the 60s, and there were a huge number of Morehouse guys that came.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so we were aware of Rauschenbusch, but where we zeroed in on by their witness was Howard Thurman.
Yeah.
And that became the more powerful person at that point. So I was very interested in your criticism. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Greg, you had a question?
Yeah. And I must, as I read the book, I realized that I was coming at this from maybe the wrong side of the tracks. One of my great grandfathers was a cop at the Haymarket.
Oh, wow.
And another was an elder at Union Park Congregational, to which the story is not complimentary.
Yeah.
At a couple of points in the book, you use the phrase working class attrition. And it's clear that one of the things that was bothering the ministers was that either the working class was not coming to church or was leaving church. I don't remember that you quote any one of them as to why that was a concern. And I could be an idealist and say that their concern was that these men were missing the gospel.
Yeah.
Or I could be a cynic and suggest that the pastors were missing the pew rents. Do you have a sense of what was behind that concern about attrition?
Yeah. Well, I think it had a lot to do with the fact that, I mean, on the pastor's side of things, I mean, this was a time when the church really still imagined itself as kind of the soul of the nation. Protestant churches had that pretty deep in their kind of DNA, that they were the conscience of the nation. They were in some sense, the bedrock of American society. And so I think for a lot of Protestants, at least, the idea that they might lose the kind of men in particular that fought in the Civil War, to them, that was just a kind of horrifying thought, because it was to really lose their foothold among the people and their sense of being important. So I think it's really a crisis of cultural influence that they're worried about,
Okay.
and having a certain kind of man in particular in the pews was really key, as they saw it, to being influential. I think that was the driver. That's my take.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great questions. Others?
I think Craig, I can't
Beth
see
raised her question.
maybe has a question.
Just an interesting note about pew rents. They really meant something. I did research years ago on a colonial church in Newport, Rhode Island. They want to know what color the pews were painted originally. We found that they were all different because the people who rented the pews would redecorate them. Sometimes they'd find them with cloth with different colors. Sometimes they'd paint them. And looking down from the balcony must have been like looking at an Oriental rug down there below.
Yeah.
Of course, the vestry was totally appalled at that. They painted them all white, which they weren't at all. But I was going to ask kind of the same question that Jim had. Were these pastors, and I was one on the El Paso, the old First Congregational Church that we mentioned so much in the book. Pretty nice building, still is. Do these pastors really, hey, we got a staff to pay, we got to heat this place? Would we rather lose Mr. Pullman or Mr. Potter, or would we rather lose a whole bunch of underpaid workmen that can't give us much of a donation anyhow? Was it a business calculation they had, or did they find something in the scripture that made them so vehemently anti-union?
Yeah. Well, the workers certainly thought it was the former. They certainly thought it had to do with the salaries and the perks. And they were going to be loath to alienate Prairie Avenue and whatnot. If they had to choose, they would rather alienate the poor. So I think that's part of it. You know, the other thing that I will say, and it's complicated, but basically, and it's sort of one of these stories of unintended consequences. I mean, another factor that did really play a role, I think, in some of the anti-union sentiment, at least, was that some union practices, some union tactics, especially the picket line, involved what many pastors saw and what many Americans in general saw in this period as a kind of violation of a sacred right, which was the right of each individual to sell their labor. And for many Americans in this period, that was, and it kind of came in an interesting kind of ironic twist, sort of, it came out of the abolition movement, right? That abolitionists, it had once been, back in the colonial period, that to be free was really, in some sense, to be independent, which meant to have your own land and to not work for somebody else. Actually, working for someone else wasn't slavery, but it was dependency, which was kind of on a sliding scale to, moving toward enslavement, actually. But in the mid 19th century, abolitionists start to make this other kind of argument that actually, no, what the definition of freedom is having a contract. And that's the difference between being enslaved and being free. The enslaved don't get to sell their labor. They don't have a contract. the free person has a contract. So there's kind of a revision, a kind of radical redefinition of freedom that happens. And for many people on the other side of the Civil War, as they're looking at labor, and especially this practice of going on strike and then preventing other people from taking your job, right? You know, that's the way a strike works. It only works if no one else takes the job. People looked at that and they said, this is arraying yourself against divine law, that somehow God himself, they would have said, has ordained it that each person should have the right. And again, at a theoretical level, the idea is maybe makes sense, but then if you get down to practice, it very quickly falls apart, right? The idea was you should be able to go, each worker should be able to go to the boss at the stockyards and say, how much do you plan to pay me? Well, I actually think I'm worth this much money. That would never have happened in Gilded Age Chicago, because there were 800 more guys that were ready to line up and take your job if you said a peep about how much you were going to get paid. Nevertheless, the idea had a lot of power. The idea that, well, no, this is the fundamental right, as part of being human, is to be able to be an individual who sells your labor to another individual for a price. And labor gets in the way of that. So that's, I mean, if you want to think about it at the level, beyond just the level of kind of crude exchange, quid pro quo, there were these kind of ideas that did take hold and become pretty important in the conversation too.
That's just a fascinating window into the ideologies at work and the theologies at work at that time period, and probably persist today. It'd be interesting to look at our own presumptions about what's important and what's a fundamental right.
Yeah.
Beth, I saw you raising.
Yeah, hi. So Heath, I have to tell you before I ask my question, I feel connected. I grew up walking distance from Notre Dame.
Did you really?
I graduated from Valparaiso, and I'm the mother of a Hoya.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, we're living parallel lives here. I love it.
I know.
I love it.
Except I've lived longer. But this whole idea of contracting, maybe what you just said has gotten into it a little bit, but there was so much emphasis on this whole contracting in the first part of the book, and then of course it moved into unionization. But what was it about contracting that made that a religious issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is part of what I found so interesting, and what I find so interesting about this material in general, right, is that people think about economics through the lens of, through theological lenses, and different kind of theological paradigms have sway in different corners of society and different periods, right? And so in that period, that idea that had come out of the abolition movement just kind of took hold, and the kind of, it was a very individual centered sense of what God wanted for our economic life. It was God had ordained that individuals would kind of navigate the economy in their own way, and that was what it meant to be a human, was to have that kind of freedom. What the union movement, right, and a lot of these laborers that I was writing about would say is, well, look, this is just ridiculous. The way we're going to experience freedom, if by that you mean like the ability to shape our own lives, is by banding together. Otherwise, we have no freedom. We don't have any ability to negotiate. But all of this is, and for a lot of these laborers, they say, look, Jesus was a carpenter. Why is my minister always on the side of the boss? And if we're going to have an ability for, us to kind of make it in society, we've got to do what the Bible calls for, which is, that the laborer is worthy of his hire. That they love that passage from the gospel. The laborer is worthy of his hire. And the way that the laborer is going to get paid what the laborer is worth is by having a union. So, it was all, and I think this is what I found so interesting, and I think it's still interesting. I mean, it's still there, although we live in a different time, but, partly these fights about labor and capital in the late 19th century were also fights over the meaning of Christianity for the world, and the meaning of Christianity for our lives, and what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to live Christian lives? What does it mean, and this is something that people were really interested in, right? What does it mean to Christianize society? that was a period when most Americans were Christian. So it wasn't, it was really thinking about, it was less about like coercive conversion and more about what would it mean for the principles that we read about in the Sermon on the Mount to infuse every aspect of life. I think we're running out of time, but I'll just give one last example of that, which is I don't know if you've ever come across this novel. I actually read it as a child growing up. Charles Sheldon's In His Steps was also sort of an attempt to kind of think this way, right? And it wasn't exactly social gospel. It was sort of social gospel-y in the sense that he was trying to apply the gospel to everyday life. But the premise of it was a social gospel novel. It was set in the Midwest. And the whole premise of it, and this is where the idea of WWJD comes from. Oftentimes we associate that with evangelical churches today, but it actually started off in kind of mainline circles. And the whole idea of it was we've cordoned Jesus off into the religious aspect of our life, what we do on Sunday morning. But Jesus wants to have something to say to the rest of our life. So every decision that you make, this is the kind of premise of the book, is that a church receives the call from its pastor to have every decision that they make be in light of the question, what would Jesus do? And so, that's where the book starts, and it kind of follows that story. It's not a great novel, to be honest, but it reflects this interest in this moment of trying to figure out, what does Christianity mean for a society that's enduring so much turmoil and conflict and doubt? And I do think that's where, as I was doing this research, I found parallels to the kind of situation that we live in today. Is a time of great turmoil, a time of great, like Joe, you said at the beginning, social movements and social conflict, polarization, a sense of great stakes. What does the gospel have to say in a moment like that? So.
Great questions. And thank you, Heath, so much for being with us tonight and for giving us such keen insights into what many of our siblings in Christ and fellow Chicagoans in the late 1800s, early 1900s were thinking. And it's good to know that we aren't alone in a lot of the issues that we're grappling with today with respect to inequality and protest and searching for the meaning of Christianity in our everyday lives.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe, and thank you all. This was really a
thank
lovely
you.
Conversation. Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Heath. That was really great.
Yeah.
I'm glad Joe knew you and could bring you along to our book discussions here.
Absolutely.
Our next book discussion for First Tuesday is in April. The book is Just Christianity, Reclaiming Progressive Christianity. I get this wrong all the time. Anyway, Just Christianity. The author is Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, and it should be a very interesting class discussion. Also, our next class coming up for adult ed on this upcoming Sunday is based on a book by Walter Brueggemann, Pandemics, Biblical Reflections, and a Call to Christian Action. So a lot to chew on in our 3 weeks before Easter. So I hope you can all join us for those. Wonderful. So anyway, thank you again, Heath.
Thank you. Take care, you all.
Thank you, Heath. Everybody
time.
Go out there and read the book if you haven't already.
Marvelous
Take
book.
care now.
Terrific. Thank you.